She demanded an open relationship 1 week before our dream wedding. I said, perfect. And booked dates with her entire bridal party. Now she's crying and her family thinks she's lost her mind. I'd been with Paige for 6 years, engaged for 18 months, and thought I knew everything about the woman I was planning to marry. We'd spent those months carefully orchestrating what was supposed to be our perfect destination wedding in Maui, 150 guests, an oceanfront ceremony, reception under the stars, the whole romantic fantasy that had cost us nearly $80,000 in deposits alone. I'm a marine biologist, methodical by nature, and I'd approached our wedding planning the same way I approach my research, with careful attention to detail and genuine excitement about the results. Paige seemed equally invested, spending hours on Pinterest boards and vendor calls, talking endlessly about our special day and how perfect everything would be. Then, exactly 7 days before we were supposed to fly to Hawaii with our families and closest friends, she dropped a bomb that changed everything. I was reviewing our final headcount for the caterer when she walked into my home office, closed the door behind her, and announced with the confidence of someone who'd clearly rehearsed this moment, "Jackson, I need to tell you something important. I've been thinking a lot about our relationship, about marriage, about committing to one person forever, and I realize I'm not ready to close that door on exploring my sexuality. I need us to have an open relationship, starting now, or I can't go through with the wedding." I stopped typing and looked at her, really looked at her, trying to process what I'd just heard. This was the woman who'd spent the last year and a half planning every detail of our wedding, who'd insisted on adding extra guests we couldn't afford, who'd cried when her dream photographer was already booked. "You want an open relationship," I repeated slowly, 1 week before our wedding. She nodded, her chin raised in that defiant way she got when she expected a fight. "I know the timing isn't ideal, but I can't ignore these feelings anymore. I feel trapped, like I'm about to close the door on a whole part of life I've never experienced. If you truly love me, you'll understand that I need this freedom to explore before I can fully commit to you." The way she said it, with such practiced conviction, made me wonder how long she'd been planning this conversation. I leaned back in my chair, studying her face, looking for any hint of uncertainty or regret. Instead, I saw someone who was clearly expecting me to panic, to beg, to negotiate. Someone who thought she held all the cards because our wedding was in 7 days and all our money was already spent. "Okay," I said simply. Her expression faltered immediately. "Okay. Yes, sir. If that's what you need, then we'll have an open relationship. You're right that I want you to be happy and fulfilled, so if this arrangement will give you that peace of mind, then I'm completely fine with it." The silence that followed was deafening. I could literally see her trying to recalibrate, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for words. This clearly wasn't the script she'd expected. You're okay with this?" she asked, her voice smaller than it had been moments before. "I mean, really okay? You're not just saying that because you're angry?" "I'm not angry at all. You've identified something important that you need, and I respect that. I think it's actually mature of you to bring this up before we get married rather than after." I turned back to my computer and started typing again. "So yes, absolutely. Open relationship it is. I'll respect whatever boundaries you want to set." She stood there for another minute, clearly thrown by my calm acceptance, before mumbling something about needing to think about logistics and leaving the room. What she didn't realize was that she'd just handed me the most revealing glimpse into her character I'd ever received, and I was already forming my own plans for how to handle this new arrangement she demanded. The next morning, Paige approached me with a carefully written list of rules for our new, open relationship, clearly having spent the night researching how other couples handled such arrangements. She sat across from me at our breakfast table, looking nervous but determined, as she read from her phone with the seriousness of someone presenting a business proposal. "So I've been thinking about boundaries," she began, avoiding eye contact. "First, we need to be completely discreet. I don't want anyone at the wedding or in our social circle knowing about this arrangement. What we do should stay private between us." I nodded, sipping my coffee and waiting for her to continue. She was clearly trying to control every aspect of this situation she'd created. "Second, neither of us brings anyone to our place. Keep it separate from our home life. Third, no emotional attachments. This is purely physical exploration, nothing that threatens our primary relationship. She looked up at me expectantly, probably hoping I'd object or negotiate. Instead, I simply said, "Those all sound reasonable. Anything else?" She seemed deflated by my continued acceptance. "Well, I was thinking maybe we should check in with each other, just to make sure we're both comfortable with how things are going." "Absolutely. Communication is important." I paused, then added my own suggestions. "I'd like to add a few things if that's okay. Complete honesty when directly asked about our activities. I won't lie to you and I expect the same courtesy. Safe practices are non-negotiable. And I agree about no emotional attachments, so if either of us starts developing feelings for someone else, we need to address it immediately." Paige nodded quickly, clearly relieved that I wasn't being difficult about her rules. "Yes, definitely. Safety first, and absolutely no feelings involved." What she didn't seem to notice was how one-sided her expectations were. Every rule she'd established was designed to let her explore while keeping me conveniently waiting at home, probably assuming I'd struggle to find anyone interested in a week-long fling with an about-to-be-married man. She had no idea that I'd already been mentally cataloging opportunities she'd unknowingly provided me over the years. "I'm glad we can handle this maturely," she said, reaching across to squeeze my hand. "I know this isn't conventional, but I really think it'll make our marriage stronger. Getting this out of my system now means I can fully commit to you afterward." I squeezed her hand back, giving her my most reassuring smile. "I think you're absolutely right. Better to explore these feelings now than wonder about them later." As she headed off to work, chattering about wedding final details and how relieved she felt about our new arrangement, I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through my contacts. I had some messages to send, and I was curious to see just how enthusiastic certain people might be about Paige's new policy. After all, she'd set the rules, and I intended to follow them exactly as she'd outlined. She wanted exploration and discretion, and I was more than happy to provide both. Over the years, I'd made mental notes during countless conversations where Paige would mention which of her friends found me attractive or had made comments about our relationship. She had this habit of sharing these observations with a mixture of pride and possessiveness, never realizing she was essentially providing me with a roadmap of interested parties. Her bridal party consisted of 3 women I knew quite well: Kendall, her maid of honor and yoga instructor who drunkenly told Paige at last year's Christmas party that I was total husband material, and that Paige was so lucky to have locked that down. Then there was Sloane, a travel blogger who'd been liking every single one of my social media posts for the past 2 years and always found excuses to hug me a little too long at group gatherings. Finally, Zara, Paige's college roommate who'd never been subtle about her attraction, openly flirting with me at parties and once telling Paige that if she ever messed up with me, Zara would be happy to console me. Each of these women had established a pattern of interest that Paige herself had documented for me through her casual mentions and complaints about their behavior. Within 24 hours of establishing our new relationship rules, I crafted carefully worded text messages to all 3 bridesmaids. I kept the tone casual but direct, explaining that Paige and I had decided to explore an open relationship before our wedding and wondering if they might be interested in grabbing dinner or drinks over the next few days. I made sure to emphasize that this was Paige's idea and that she was fully supportive of the arrangement, knowing that detail would be crucial for their comfort level. The responses came back faster than I'd anticipated, and each one exceeded my expectations. Kendall replied within an hour with an enthusiastic, "Oh my God, are you serious? I've been waiting for this opportunity for literally years. When and where?" Sloane's response was more measured but equally positive. "This is unexpected but honestly really exciting. I know this amazing restaurant I've been wanting to review for my blog. Would you like to join me there tomorrow night?" But Zara's reaction was the most telling. She called me immediately, her voice barely containing her excitement as she asked, "Is this really happening? Like, Paige actually said this was okay? Because I need to hear this directly from her before I believe it." I assured her that Paige was not only okay with it but had been the one to suggest the open relationship in the first place. She specifically mentioned that she wanted both of us to feel free to explore before we committed to marriage, I explained, which was technically true, just not in the way Zara would interpret it. After hanging up with Zara, I sat back and marveled at how quickly Paige's manipulation tactic had transformed into something she definitely hadn't planned for. She'd expected to hold the threat of the wedding cancellation over my head while pursuing her own interests, probably assuming I'd be too devastated or desperate to take advantage of the arrangement myself. Instead, I now had 3 dinner dates lined up with her closest friends, all of whom had been transparently interested in me for years and were now officially given permission to act on those feelings. I spent the evening planning the logistics, choosing restaurants, and preparing for what I suspected would be very enlightening conversations about Paige's character and our relationship dynamics. Each of these women knew Paige intimately and had observed our relationship from the outside for years. I had a feeling their perspectives were going to be far more revealing than any premarital counseling session could have been. The next evening, I was cutting vegetables for dinner when I casually mentioned my upcoming social calendar to Paige. "By the way, I took your advice about exploring the open relationship arrangement," I said, keeping my tone conversational as I diced an onion. "I've got dinner with Kendall tomorrow night, coffee with Sloane on Thursday, and drinks with Zara on Friday." The sound of Paige's wine glass hitting the counter was sharp and sudden. I looked up to see her face had gone completely pale, her mouth hanging open as she processed what I'd just said. "What did you just say?" she stammered, gripping the edge of the counter like she needed physical support. "I set up a few dates, just like we discussed. Following all the rules we established, discreet, no emotional attachments, keeping it separate from our home life." I returned to my chopping, acting as though this was the most natural conversation in the world. Wait, she said, her voice rising in pitch. "When I said open relationship, I didn't mean with my bridesmaids. That's completely different." I paused and looked at her with genuine confusion. "You didn't specify any restrictions about who we could see. In fact, when I suggested we add more boundaries yesterday, you seemed happy that I was being so agreeable about your rules. But these are my friends. My closest friends. You can't seriously think I meant for you to date my entire bridal party." The panic in her voice was unmistakable now, and I could see her mind racing as she realized how badly her manipulation had backfired. "They're consenting adults who seem excited about the opportunity," I replied calmly. "Kendall said she's been hoping for a chance like this for years. Sloane wants to take me to some restaurant she's reviewing for her blog. And Zara specifically called to confirm that you were really okay with this arrangement before she agreed to anything." Paige's face went from pale to red as the full implications hit her. "You talked to all of them? They all said yes? Oh my God, this is a disaster." She started pacing around the kitchen, running her hands through her hair. "I need to call them. I need to explain that this isn't what I meant. They can't actually think I'm okay with this." "But you are okay with it," I pointed out reasonably. "You're the one who wanted the open relationship. You're the one who said we should both feel free to explore before marriage. I'm just following the agreement you created." She whipped out her phone and started frantically scrolling through her contacts. "I'm calling my mother. And my sister. They need to know what's happening. This is insane." Over the next hour, I listened to Paige make increasingly hysterical phone calls to her family members, trying to explain the situation while making herself sound like the victim. Her mother's voice was loud enough that I could hear her screaming through the phone about how I was destroying their little girl and demanding to speak with me directly. Her father apparently threatened to fly to our city immediately to have a serious conversation with me about my behavior. Her sister kept asking why Paige had agreed to an open relationship in the first place, which sent Paige into even more frantic explanations about feeling trapped and needing space to think. By the time she hung up from her final family call, Paige was in full meltdown mode, alternating between tears and rage as she realized that her attempt to manipulate me had spectacularly exploded in her face. "You have to cancel these dates," she demanded, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "I was wrong, okay? I didn't really want an open relationship. I just needed to know that you'd fight for me, that you'd prove how much you wanted to marry me." The admission hung in the air between us like a confession, and I finally understood exactly what kind of person I'd been planning to marry. Despite Paige's increasingly desperate pleas and her family's angry phone calls, I followed through with all 3 dates over the next 3 nights, and each conversation proved more enlightening than I'd expected. My dinner with Kendall at her favorite sushi restaurant turned into a 4-hour deep dive into Paige's character that I probably should have had years ago. "I have to be honest with you," Kendall said after her second sake. "I've been watching Paige manipulate situations for as long as I've known her, and this open relationship thing is just her latest tactic. She did something similar with her college boyfriend when she thought he was getting too comfortable, created some crisis to make him prove his devotion." Kendall explained that Paige had a pattern of manufacturing problems whenever she felt like she wasn't getting enough attention or control in a relationship. She's always testing people, seeing how far she can push them before they push back. The fact that you're not playing her game is probably driving her absolutely insane right now. When I asked why none of her friends had ever mentioned this concerning behavior, Kendall shrugged. "We've tried to bring it up, but Paige doesn't take criticism well. She either gets defensive or plays the victim until everyone feels bad for questioning her. It's easier to just go along with whatever drama she's creating." My evening with Sloane at the upscale restaurant she'd been wanting to review was equally revealing, though in a different way. Sloane had always struck me as the most diplomatic of Paige's friends, but after a bottle of wine, she became surprisingly candid about what she'd observed over the years. "Paige has always been selfish," she said bluntly, cutting into her perfectly plated duck breast. "She expects everyone around her to revolve around her needs and emotions, but she never returns that energy. I've watched her dismiss your interests, interrupt your stories, and redirect conversations back to herself constantly. Honestly, I've been wondering for months if you were happy in that relationship." Sloane also revealed something that shocked me. She asked me last year if I thought you might cheat on her because you were too good to be true, and she couldn't understand why you'd want to marry someone like her. I think that insecurity is what drives a lot of her manipulative behavior. She's constantly testing whether you'll stick around when things get difficult. But my coffee date with Zara provided the most damaging insights into Paige's character and our relationship dynamics. Zara had known Paige the longest, dating back to their freshman year of college, and she had stories that painted a clear picture of a person who'd never learned to handle relationships without manipulation and control. She used to do this thing in college where she'd flirt with other guys at parties while her boyfriend was there, just to see if he'd get jealous, Zara told me over our 3rd round of espresso. If he didn't react, she'd escalate until he either caused a scene or broke up with her. Then she'd cry and say she was just testing his love. Zara leaned forward conspiratorially. "She actually asked me to keep an eye on you over the years, to report back if I thought you were getting too comfortable or taking her for granted. She was constantly worried that you'd realize you could do better and leave her." Each woman expressed genuine shock that Paige had used the open relationship ultimatum, and all 3 admitted they'd been questioning whether she was truly ready for marriage. "She's been complaining for months about feeling trapped by the wedding planning," Kendall had mentioned. "Not trapped by you specifically, but trapped by the idea of commitment and adult responsibility." Meanwhile, Paige was having daily meltdowns at home, calling in sick to work and frantically trying to convince each of her bridesmaids to cancel their dates with me. According to Sloane, Paige had called her crying and begging her to think about their friendship before going through with our dinner. But by that point, all 3 women were more interested in understanding what had driven Paige to such a destructive decision than they were in protecting her from the consequences of her own manipulation. With just 2 days remaining before our scheduled flight to Maui, Paige's family descended on our city like an emergency response team, booking last-minute flights and hotel rooms for what they called a crisis intervention. Her parents, both siblings, and even her 70-year-old grandmother had coordinated their arrival to present a united front against what they saw as my deliberate sabotage of their daughter's happiness. They'd reserved a conference room at their hotel and summoned me for what her father ominously called a family meeting to discuss the future. I arrived to find them arranged around the table like a tribunal, with Paige's red-rimmed eyes and tear-stained face serving as evidence of my alleged crimes. Her mother immediately launched into an emotional speech about how I was destroying their little girl and humiliating the entire family with my vindictive behavior. "We've spent months preparing for this wedding," her father said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "We've invited 150 people, spent thousands on travel arrangements, and now you're throwing it all away because you want to play games with our daughter's emotions." Her brother, who'd always barely tolerated me, was more direct in his accusations. "This is sick, man. Dating her friends right before your wedding? What kind of psychopath does that? If you think this is some kind of revenge, you're even more messed up than I thought." Even her grandmother, usually the voice of reason in their family, looked at me with disappointment. "Jackson, dear, I don't understand what's happened to you. Paige tells us you used to be such a kind, loving man. This behavior doesn't sound like the person she's described all these years." I listened to each accusation calmly, waiting for them to finish their coordinated attack before responding. When the room finally fell silent, I looked directly at Paige and asked, "Did you tell them that the open relationship was your idea? That you gave me an ultimatum 1 week before our wedding, saying you needed to explore your sexuality or you'd call off the ceremony?" The silence that followed was deafening. Paige's face crumpled as she realized I was going to expose the full truth of what had happened. That's not how it happened," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "Then please, explain to your family exactly how it did happen," I said evenly. "Tell them about your speech about feeling trapped and needing freedom to explore before committing to marriage. Tell them about the rules you established for our new arrangement." Her mother looked between us with growing confusion. "Paige, what is he talking about? You said he just started dating your friends out of nowhere." The family intervention quickly devolved into chaos as Paige was forced to admit the truth about her ultimatum, though she tried to frame it as a moment of pre-wedding anxiety rather than a calculated manipulation. Her father's anger shifted from me to her as he realized his daughter had created this entire crisis. "You threatened to cancel the wedding unless he agreed to an open relationship?" he asked incredulously. "Paige, what were you thinking?" But the most damaging revelation came when Paige finally broke down completely and confessed the real reason behind her ultimatum. "I never actually wanted an open relationship," she sobbed. "I just needed to know that he'd fight for me. My friend Rachel said that men only value what they think they might lose, so I thought if I threatened to open our relationship, he'd realize how much he needed me and become more attentive and romantic." Her admission that this had all been an elaborate test to manipulate my emotions pushed me over the edge. I stood up slowly, looking around the table at her family members who were now staring at Paige with a mixture of shock and disappointment. "I want you all to understand something clearly," I said, my voice steady despite the anger coursing through me. "I have spent 6 years loving your daughter unconditionally. I've supported her dreams, planned a future around her happiness, and was prepared to commit my entire life to building something beautiful together. Instead of communicating her insecurities or asking for reassurance like a mature adult, she chose to manipulate and test me 1 week before our wedding." I looked directly at Paige, who was now sobbing into her hands. "The wedding is off. Not because of the open relationship, not because of the dates with her friends, but because I refuse to marry someone who thinks love is a game to be won through manipulation and emotional warfare." The room erupted in arguments, pleas, and accusations, but I'd already made my decision and quietly left them to sort out the aftermath of Paige's destructive choices. 2 months later, I was settling into my new life in San Diego, having accepted a research position with the Scripps Institution of Oceanography that I'd been considering for over a year but had put on hold for our wedding plans. The move across the country felt like the fresh start I needed, putting 3,000 miles between myself and the wreckage of what I'd thought was going to be my future. My parents had been incredibly supportive once they learned the full truth about Paige's manipulation, with my mother actually admitting she'd always had reservations about Paige's character but hadn't wanted to interfere. The financial fallout from the canceled wedding was significant. We lost most of the deposits, though some vendors were surprisingly understanding when they heard the circumstances. Paige's family blamed me publicly for the cancellation, but privately, several of her relatives reached out to apologize for the family meeting ambush and to express their disappointment in her behavior. Her social media presence told the story of someone struggling to rebuild her image and cope with the consequences of her actions. Her Instagram posts had shifted from wedding planning content to cryptic inspirational quotes about learning hard lessons and toxic masculinity, along with photos of herself looking deliberately thoughtful and introspective. She'd posted several lengthy captions about growing as a person and recognizing unhealthy patterns, though she never directly acknowledged her role in destroying our relationship. The most satisfying update came through mutual friends who reported that her attempts to repair her friendships had been largely unsuccessful. Kendall, Sloane, and Zara had all distanced themselves from Paige after learning about her manipulation tactics, with Kendall being particularly vocal about feeling betrayed by years of friendship with someone who'd been using her as a pawn in relationship games. Several people in our extended social circle had called Paige out for her destructive behavior, leading to her increasing isolation from the support network she'd taken for granted. The irony wasn't lost on me that her attempt to test my devotion had cost her not just our relationship, but also several of her closest friendships and much of her family's respect. What made the entire situation even more satisfying was the genuine connection I'd developed with Kendall, who had indeed visited me in San Diego for a weekend that had nothing to do with revenge or manipulation. She was planning to relocate to California for her yoga certification program, and we'd been exploring the possibility of building something real together, something based on honest communication rather than tests and games. "It's funny," she'd said during our last video call, "Paige spent so much energy trying to create drama and competition that she pushed away everyone who actually cared about her. Meanwhile, you just focused on being genuine and ended up with everything she thought she was fighting for." I reflected often on how Paige's ultimatum had actually been the best thing that could have happened to our relationship, providing the clarity I needed to see her true character before making a permanent legal commitment. Her manipulation attempt hadn't just revealed her willingness to use emotional warfare to get what she wanted, it had also shown me that I deserved a partner who valued honesty, communication, and mutual respect over power games and manufactured drama. The woman I'd been planning to marry had never actually existed. She'd been a carefully constructed persona designed to secure commitment while hiding a fundamentally selfish and manipulative nature underneath.